All right. Hello, everyone. It is definitely bright up here, like people were saying. Not that I thought you were lying, but great to see you all. It's been an amazing day full of such interesting and insightful presentations, and I could not be more excited to be kicking off the last one of the day. So with that being said, let's get started. So today I will be talking about how your organization can use behavioral data to inform your security awareness campaigns and measure impact. But before we begin, I'll start with a quick introduction. My name is Jade, and I'm a program management analyst on Salesforce's Security Awareness team. And my role revolves primarily around using data to inform our targeted data-driven program. So I'll be providing a little bit of insight today into that process, what that looks like, and how you can maybe take some things away to your organization. All right, so if any of you read the Verizon 2024 data breach investigations report, you'll know that in 2024, 68% of breaches involved a non-malicious human element, like social engineering, or a simple human error, like sending confidential information to the wrong person. Obviously, when these kinds of incidents occur, regardless of whether they're accidental or intentional, it can lead to exposure of sensitive data and potentially diminish customer trust, which is obviously bad for the business. That's where we come in as security awareness professionals. It's crucial that we build a robust, data-driven, targeted security awareness program to help us manage areas of the highest risk and create a strong culture of trust throughout our organizations. So I'll walk you through the agenda for today. I'll kick off the presentation by talking about how your organization can use data to measure human security risk. First, I'll start with why it's a good thing to do in the first place and why it's worth investing the time and resources into doing so. Next, I'll walk us through how to do it with one framework for data analysis. And finally, I'll end that section with inputs and outputs that go into a data-driven targeted campaign. Next, I'll talk about how we can provide targeted education to high-risk populations. So I'll touch on Salesforce's levers framework for driving change and how you can apply that to your organization's training, communications, and events. And finally, I'll talk about how we can integrate data analysis into our strategy to drive behavioral change and improve security posture by tracking campaign actions over time. So let's get started with using data to measure human security risk. So here are some components of a data-driven security awareness program. Your program may contain all of these, some of these, just one of these, or maybe you have other components that aren't on this slide. But in general, things I'll talk about, number one, you might have your ongoing campaigns, right? Think Cybersecurity Awareness Month or your annual security training. This is ongoing year after year. It's evergreen, so the content doesn't really change much, and it's typically targeting all employees. So this is the bread and butter of your security awareness campaign. On the other end of that spectrum, you have your ad hoc campaigns. So these are a little bit more of a reactive approach. These might be asks from leadership based on trends in the industry or incidents that have occurred at other companies that you want to prepare your own company for. And then in the middle of that, we have our targeted campaigns. And this is where the data really comes in. Here you can get really proactive. This is kind of in the middle in terms of the hyper-targeted, super short-term ad hoc campaigns and the super long-term evergreen ongoing campaigns. Here you can really take a look using data at what your highest risk groups are, who they are, what they're doing, and why it's important to help drive that behavioral change for them and therefore drive the greatest targeted impact. So today I'll be focusing primarily on these types of campaigns. All right, before we start, obviously, it's going to take a lot of time and resources to invest in targeted programming in the first place, right? Like my team, for example, had headcount just to hire me, someone who analyzes data in their day-to-day role to help inform our targeted programs. So why is it something that would be valuable for your organization to invest in? Well, number one, targeted programming helps drive behavioral change for high-risk groups. So by conducting the data analysis and pinpointing groups that are the highest risk, you can address threats that could potentially have the greatest impact to your organization. Number two, employees are more likely to engage with and retain information that aligns with their values and their goals in their day-to-day lives, right? Seems pretty clear. And that's obviously the goal. We want to make sure that the employees we're targeting engage with our data so that they can drive change in their behavior. Next up, it's a lot easier to measure the effectiveness of a campaign when your sample size and your audience is smaller. And so you can use specific metrics and data from those targeted groups to really demonstrate the impact of your program. Additionally, you could potentially reduce resource costs because instead of using a one-size-fits-all broad brush approach, you're focusing on areas that are already affecting your organization with the greatest impact. And finally, you can use the same data processes over and over again year after year and switch up the content or the audience to improve future campaigns and make them more effective over time. So here are all the reasons why I believe it's a great asset to have targeted programming in your security program. Now let's talk a little bit about how you can do it, right? So here's one framework for data analysis. At the core of almost every data-driven security awareness program is behavioral data. We need that data in order to drive behavioral change because we need to know the current state and the desired end state. And so there's some data that you might be able to get just on your team alone. For example, phishing data. If your security awareness team deals with a vendor, you probably get that information from them. However, there's other types of data that it's really useful to build relationships with stakeholders in order to get that information, right? Stakeholders both within and outside of security. Some examples, incident response teams could provide data on user negligence incidents that could help inform your program. Threat intelligence could help provide you with quarterly reports or insights on what's going on in the industry. Same goes for enterprise security and insider threat. Basically, the more stakeholders you can speak with and get data from, the better, as that will help you inform your campaign. Now, what really colors the behavioral data, though, is before I talk about that, this behavioral data really just talks about what is happening and when is it happening. So what are the incidents that are going on and what is the timeline that it's happening in? Now I'll talk about what really helps color that data, which is employee attribution data. And I want to preface this by saying Salesforce only uses aggregate data to develop our targeted campaigns. So trust is our #1 value, not just for our customers, but also for our employees. We want to make sure that we uphold their privacy to the highest standard. So if we don't need to have individual employee data, there's no reason for us to use it. But by employee attribution data, I'm really talking about things like business unit or department, job titles, management, even where your employees are located by their geographic region. Looking at this kind of data really provides context as to who is involved in these types of incidents and where is this happening. Finally, you have your human risk measurement. So if you really want to level up this framework, you can calculate a risk score, which helps you prioritize which areas to focus on, high-risk groups, and also help you determine next steps that would have the greatest impact. And so this is really answering the why and the how of your program. Why are these incidents happening, and how can we change these behaviors? So what does this look like from a data analyst perspective? I'll use an example. Let's say over the last 3 quarters, I've seen an uptick in, hypothetically, the number of incidents involving credentials. So that could be passwords being stored where they're not supposed to be, passwords stored in plain text, right? That could be a trend that I've seen over the last few quarters, and I could get maybe a little bit granular with that behavioral data, but that's pretty much the extent of it. I just have this one trend line. If I really want to color that data, I can look at employee attribution data and separate that line into different ones. So let's say each line on this graph is a different business unit. You could have sales, finance, engineering, the list goes on. By looking at that kind of data, I can see that hypothetically, engineers and the finance department are the ones who are really driving this increase, and no one else is really creating an impact. And that really allows me to hone in, again, on who's causing these incidents and audience details about those people. And then finally, it's important to integrate all of this into a human risk measurement. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in essence, what this does is it allows us to prioritize what types of campaigns are actually worthwhile to us, right? Even though we see these trends, they might be out there, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a great risk to our organization. So this is one way that we can help evaluate whether or not these different campaigns are worth our time. So here's one way to measure human risk, right? In the context of user negligence incidents. As an example, you may be getting user negligence incidents from your incident response team, right? If you build that relationship with them, and they might send you a list of a bunch of different incidents that happened over the last X quarters. You might be able to determine what types of incidents are happening. You have the number of incidents, right? And you might also get the severity of those incidents. So step 0 to 4 and so on. By using just that information, you can calculate a risk score that helps you measure the human risk caused by those types of incidents. So you can take the frequency of those incidents, put it on the y-axis, and take the average severity of those incidents, which You can come up with your own calculation, but one way to do it is to do a weighted average. You plot that on the x-axis, and by multiplying those two, severity and frequency, you can get your risk score for each type of incident. So going back to my previous example, right, we were talking about maybe finance is driving an increase in incidents related to credentials because they're maybe sharing passwords and emails, right? And engineering is also contributing to the increase in incidents involving credentials because they're storing secrets in code. Well, through this risk metric, we could maybe plot those two types of incidents and see which ones are green and which ones are red. So we could say, well, finance maybe is in the green, so even though these incidents are happening, they're not happening that often, and when they do happen, they're not that severe, so we don't really need to focus on that. Instead, maybe we should be focusing on what's in the red, like in my previous example, engineering incidents where engineers are storing secrets in code. And so just to sum up all of the inputs and outputs that go into a targeted data-driven campaign based on this type of data, we have one of our inputs, behavioral data, which really just outlines overall trends in risk and the time frame. Then we have our employee attribution data, again, as I described, in aggregate, which helps us outline our high-risk groups and details about them, like what business units they work in, where they're located, anything that could be valuable to our program. And finally, we have our measurement of human risk, and that really helps us take everything we've learned and find a way to prioritize those risks and also to determine the potential impact. All right, so next up, I will be talking about how we can provide targeted education to high-risk populations using this data. So this is a framework developed by Salesforce's change management team, and it's typically applied to sales or services, but our team on security awareness aligns with them philosophically, and at the end of the day, our goal is to drive behavioral change, so this applies to us as well. The 6 pieces of this pie are leadership, ecosystem, values, enablement, rewards, and structures. And Salesforce has done the research and found that successful change is 10 times more likely when 4 or more of all 6 levers are engaged. So I'll just walk us through an example what each of these pieces of the pie could be. Let's say for your New Year's resolution, you want to become a professional tennis player. That's been your life's aspiration, right? And you really want to get toward that goal. What might you do by following this framework? Well, you might look up to your leaders, right? Think Serena Williams, people who you really have looked up to all your life. And anything that they say, you're probably going to listen to, right? So that's the leadership part of this pie. For your ecosystem, you might have peers who have the same goals as you. You might have mentors who are maybe a little bit ahead of you and could help teach you something. You might be in different Slack groups or listen to podcasts and just share insights with people who are on the same level as you, right? That's your ecosystem. For values, these are things that you really need to integrate into your own values to help drive that change. So for example, grit, determination, resilience, mental and physical strength. These are all things that go into becoming a pro tennis player. Enablement could be tooling, right? Resources that you could use. Maybe you hire a personal trainer, or maybe you look at online classes to see different things that you can do to perfect your swing. That all goes into enablement. Finally, touching on rewards and structures, rewards could be something as simple as getting a trophy from your first tournament, right? And structures are the policies and procedures that you have to follow. So tennis, like any sport, has rules. If you break the rules, you could be disqualified. So you want to make sure that you know every rule that you need to follow for that game. So we use an example on how you can do that in maybe an athletic setting. But at the end of the day, some of us may be athletes. I know for one, I'm not trying to be a professional tennis player. I would rather learn about how we can apply this to a security awareness campaign. So let's talk about an example that could be applied in real life in an engineering campaign. So going back to the example I said before about engineers maybe storing credentials in code. You might want to start off with something in communications, right, to hit the leadership and the ecosystem pieces of the pie. So talking about leadership, it would be great if you could get leadership buy-in from stakeholders, right? So again, leveraging those relationships outside of the security organization, speaking with engineering leaders, and maybe even delivering them pre-packaged messaging from the security awareness team that they can bring to their team. I don't know about you, but if I were an engineer, I would be much more likely to listen to my manager than some random person from the security organization. So that's something that could be really effective. Number 2, leveraging existing channels and tools. So this really ties into the ecosystem, meeting engineers where they're at. maybe they have certain places or watering holes where they get their most of their information. Salesforce, we use Slack. Your organization may use Teams or may just use email or some other form of communication, but there's got to be some channel that the engineers congregate at. And so our goal would be to really figure out what those channels are and who we can contact to make sure that our content meets them where they're at. And then finally, personalized messaging. So this kind of ties into that as well, but whether you have maybe a Slack bot or some sort of email list, any way that you can really target and refine your campaign, that is definitely going to help you. Next up, in-person events. So for example, an engineering leadership workshop, that might be something helpful to do in this type of campaign. This would help you hit the values and enablement of the pie. So number one, leading by example, right? At Salesforce, we have our number one value of trust. We would probably aspire to integrate that into our approach when going up to these leaders and having them bring that same value down to their teams. Resources for engagement. This touches into enablement, right? So making sure that both the engineers and the leadership have the tools and resources and they know exactly who to contact on your team in the event that they need any help. And then finally, creating a positive trust culture. So psychological safety is super important, in my opinion, to make sure that employees don't feel like anything is being done to punish them and they feel safe, being able to report any mistakes that they have made or mistakes that they could potentially make by not knowing information. And so making sure that there's a positive trust culture being passed down by leaders to those engineers could also be something that you could leverage to address the more parts of this framework. And then finally, training, right? This is an essential part of a security awareness program. It's the easiest way to educate employees about the best behaviors to do. How can we make it effective for this targeted group? Well, in this hypothetical situation, you could do targeted educational content. That's a no-brainer. But you could also really highlight the policies and procedures that they need to know. So some engineers may be sharing passwords in their code, not out of any malicious intent, but because they genuinely didn't know that they weren't supposed to do that. And so this is where explaining to them the rules that they need to follow really counts. Next up, manager escalation. So again, this is something that you don't have to do on your team, but something that we do on our team is if an employee doesn't complete a required training, the manager is notified. And not in a punitive way, again, it's really more of a heads up to say, hey, this training is required and mandatory for your employee. Maybe give them a nudge to complete it. But again, maintaining psychological safety is super important for this, and that ties into the leadership portion of the pie. And finally, tying into rewards, badges upon completion. So what do I mean by that? You don't have to give your employees a physical badge to reward them. That's great, and honestly, I would love to get a physical badge every time I completed training. I would have a huge collection. But something that we do at Salesforce is we have a platform called Trailhead, right? And you may have a different training platform. Trailhead isn't just internal, anyone can use it, but anytime you complete a trail, you're rewarded with a digital badge. And each badge looks a little bit different. It's kind of fun. You can collect them as if you're on a scavenger hunt. And so that really ties into the rewards aspect of this pie. And again, it doesn't have to be anything that's physical or costs extra money. It can be as simple as a little digital thing for people to collect. And so that is kind of an example of how you can hit all 6 pieces of the levers framework in one targeted engineering campaign, which theoretically, according to that data, could make it 10 times more successful than if you only hit 1, 2, or 3 pieces of the pie. All right, so tying this all together, we've talked about the data, we've talked about tying it into education and training. Now, how do we demonstrate that we've driven behavioral change and also improved our organization's security posture? Well, surprise, surprise, data comes back in. So again, all hypothetical data, as it has been throughout this entire presentation, but the objective of this would be to track campaign actions over time and observe a decrease in the targeted incidents as a campaign progresses. So let's say we had that engineering campaign that I was talking about before. We would track the number of engineering credential-related incidents over time, and over that same period of time, we would track how many campaign actions we've done. So live workshops, how many trainings were assigned, how many communications were sent out, etc. And that's data we are already collecting. This is not net new data, right? And so theoretically, there shouldn't be any super extra additional effort put into this. But you can plot this. So you have the number of incidents in the blue, and you have campaign actions in the red. And you can see that there's a downward trend line here, right? This is not real data. I think everyone wishes that their data looked like this. I wish I could see a downward trend line for every campaign. But ultimately, this just demonstrates programmatic impact to leadership and to stakeholders. So, just by looking at this graph, they already know the effectiveness of your program, right? And also, it's using data you already have, so you can repeat these processes over and over again with different targeted campaigns, and it will always work out to be a graph like this. But another plus of this is it helps you understand where you can revisit or shift the direction of your campaigns in the future. So let's say in April, we released that in-person workshop, and we saw a huge decrease in engineering incidents related to credentials immediately after. Obviously, correlation and causation are not the same, and it's very hard to say that we caused that drop. However, we can say, hey, maybe this is something that's really effective and something we can revisit in future campaigns. Maybe employees in this targeted group like more in-person things. Whereas if you do another targeted campaign with that financial department I talked about earlier, maybe trainings are more effective for them. But you can get really granular with this data. And again, the benefit of this is you already have it because you did the work earlier and proactively to set up this campaign. All right, so key takeaways from this presentation. We talked about the data, right? We talked about how leveraging behavioral data in combination with employee attribution data and that human risk score that I talked about before can really help set the stage for an effective targeted campaign, right? These campaign inputs really help you determine the who, what, when, where, why, and how of your campaign, and you can do that all before the big incident even happens. This is all stuff that you can do to prepare and make sure that your employees are also prepared before any major incident with huge high severity could occur. Number two, building stakeholder relationships, both internal and external to security, is useful for developing a robust data-driven program across multiple messaging channels. So the key really is to build those relationships and partnerships with teams like threat intelligence, insider threat, both within security, and also external to security. So knowing your points of contact for whatever groups you're trying to target in these campaigns. That is crucial to develop a data-driven program that really understands where your audiences are at, what their watering holes are, and how you can drive the greatest impact to them while aligning with their incentives and motivations. Third, engaging at least 4 out of those 6 levers that I talked about from Salesforce's levers framework helps maximize the effectiveness of these targeted campaigns. That's pretty self-explanatory, but I think we could see from the Serena Williams example with tennis, becoming a pro tennis player, and also that engineering campaign example that regardless of whether you're doing sales, services, running a security awareness program, or just trying to become a pro athlete, this framework is really effective in helping you drive behavioral change. And finally, tracking incidents versus the number of campaign actions allows us to measure the impact of our campaigns and also shift direction when necessary. So it provides us with a concrete, quantitative way to demonstrate to leadership and stakeholders the value of our programs so that maybe they invest in more data analysts or seek, expanding our program. And number 2, allow us to shift direction when we need to. If we think that a campaign failed for some reason, we have the data that we can look at to pinpoint exactly what might have caused that failure. Likewise, if a campaign succeeded, we can do the same there. And so that is it for this presentation. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you so much, Jade. We have some time for questions. So just a reminder for those in the room, please raise your hand. And those for online, use Slack. We are going to go ahead and do one question that was quite popular in Slack. Are you using a human risk management platform, or are you using a homegrown solution to track these metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So everything I just talked about from a data analysis perspective, we do in-house. So we have Salesforce owns Tableau. That's one of our platforms. And the data analysis that I do and other members of my team could do if they were involved in data analysis would also be on Tableau. But I know that there are definitely vendors out there and platforms out there that could provide similar or better insights. So it really depends on what your program needs and how you want to tailor it.
Question. You brought up the idea of, I think you said you anonymized the user data and look more at the segment level. But the phrase was psychological safety. A lot of CISOs are thinking about, how do I empower the user to own their risk and understand the good and the bad that they kind of bring to the organization Monday through Friday? How do you balance the safety of the user and also educating the end user on what they're doing? How does that conversation go internally, and where are you guys at in that conversation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I wish I could see your face if it wasn't so right. But yeah, I mean, that is a balance that it's a fine line we walk on every day, right? Right. We want to make sure that our campaigns respect employees' privacy and don't have employees feel like they are being targeted, while also making sure that we address areas of the highest risk. And so, I mean, that is kind of how the conversations go internally. It really is a case by case basis. But in general, we don't look at individual data because the odds of one employee being the greatest source of human risk in an organization, number one, is very low. And number two, if we don't need to look at that data, there really is no reason for us to potentially risk violating an employee's privacy. But yeah, I agree 100%. I think, having employees be able to look at their own personal risk profile at some organizations might be a good thing. At other organizations, it might be bad. And I think it really goes to the teams of those organizations to understand what their company's culture is. So like you were saying, psychological safety, that is a big thing here at Salesforce, and we want to make sure that employees never feel targeted or feel like they're being pointed out.
All right, remember, if you're in the audience, please raise your hand. I have another one from online. Earlier, when you were showing the graphs of, maybe it's engineering and finance that are really hitting on this one, security issue, right? How do you determine the severity of when you actually need to get involved versus, yeah, it might be spiking, but it's not actually important enough for us to have to do a campaign on?
Yeah, that's another fantastic question. So that's where the human risk score really ties in, right? So the example that I gave was for user negligence incidents. So if we were to take incidents involving credentials, we might look specifically at engineers versus people in finance and see what the average severity of those incidents were, and also combine that with the frequency of those incidents and then plot it. That would really be the foundation of how we would calculate that risk. If there are any outliers, we could also potentially point that out in the data. But at the end of the day, you can get as granular as you want. You can look at it in aggregate, but having some sort of consistent risk score that you can apply fairly to each group is really crucial for that.
Hi there. I'm Alicia from Tesco. I thought the whole presentation was fantastic, so thank you.
Thank
I
you.
was particularly interested in the human risk score and your average severity. Who was involved in the weighting of severity across your teams to be able to come up with that to a level in which leadership were comfortable with?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So for that severity metric, we really just assigned points to those different severity levels proportional to what they're rated, right? So Sev 0, Sev 1, Sev 2, it is a linear scale. So we did the same thing in reverse. So Sev 0 would be 5 points, Sev 4 would be, I think, 1. I showed in that slide. But again, that could change based on, what leadership wants or what your team thinks is appropriate, or, speaking with the incident response teams themselves and seeing how they calculate risk scores on their own teams. It's important not to be too siloed, but instead to collaborate with other stakeholders. And I think merging our thought processes with those of other organizations in security is always helpful. But yeah, that's how we thought about it. Yeah.
All right, one final question from Justine on Slack. Do you guys utilize just-in-time notifications, one-on-one interventions as part of your trail path training to impact behavior change?
Wow, what amazing questions. So yeah, just-in-time training is something that we're actually actively working on. That is something that, I think is valuable to make sure that employees aren't just receiving training on a yearly basis or, on a quarterly basis or even based on just their role, but also when they're in the act, getting pings just in time. I think that's something really important. We haven't implemented that yet, but that's something that's definitely in the works potentially. And you also mentioned one-on-one interventions. So again, we try not to target employees based on their personal data. We don't want anyone to feel like just because they clicked one too many times on a phishing test, that someone's going to go after them. And what we try to do instead is just send training to people who need it most, and we try not to intervene in a way that could make someone feel singled out.
Awesome. Everybody give Jade one more big round of applause.